Landing back on Argentine soil. After more than 40 years, this small plane, a British Skyvan model, is being repatriated from the United States. During Argentina's dictatorship, it was infamously used to eliminate opponents of the regime by throwing them into the bay outside the capital. Carlos Oviedo's sister was one of the victims of these so-called death flights.
She was kidnapped on December the 8th, 1977, after being arrested in a church. She was on one of the death flights a few days later, on the 14th. She and the others were thrown into the sea from this plane.
For families of victims, the return of the last of these Skyvans to Argentina is blistering evidence of the atrocities committed by the military junta. From 1976 to 1983, around 3,000 people are believed to have been killed on these death flights.
You have to fight constantly to find new evidence so that history will not be forgotten. We must demand justice and insist on obtaining it.
Blending in with the crowd is the man responsible for finding the twin-engine plane in Florida after decades of searching. Italian photographer Giancarlo Ceraudo has always been enamored with airplanes and the history of Argentina. We met up with him in Buenos Aires at one of his exhibitions that tells the story of how he discovered the final Skyvan.
This photo here has become symbolic of the plane in 2013. My heart almost stopped when I saw this plane that I had been searching for so long.
His hunt for one of the planes behind the death flights began when he was on assignment in Argentina in the early 2000s. He quickly became obsessed with the dictatorship.
I always had a peculiar relationship with objects, like archaeologists who analyze objects, interpret them to write stories. So I began asking myself, where are these planes? But when I asked around, no one could answer me.
Deep down, he was convinced that finding the Skyvans could also help find those responsible for the death flights. But at the time, his message fell on deaf ears.
The Argentinians were more concerned with searching for people, those who disappeared during the dictatorship. So maybe they didn't have time or the resources.
After 5 years searching on his own, he managed to convince an Argentinian investigative journalist to help. Miriam Lewin, seen in this photo, is a survivor and former political prisoner of the dictatorship. Together, they began tracking down the whereabouts of the Skyvans.
There were a total of 5 planes, and 2 of them were lost in the Falklands War. So we started searching in databases, in aviation literature, consulting specialists.
And the only plane that was still flying was in Fort Lauderdale and the United States. It was being used to deliver mail between Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and the Bahamas.
The photographer's intuition proved to be correct. In the cockpit, sitting undisturbed for decades, was indisputable evidence: the flight records from the time of the dictatorship. The 2 of them contacted a pilot to help interpret the data.
He immediately identified the flights that made no sense from an aeronautical perspective. They made no sense because the flights had the same point of departure and arrival. The planes flew until they almost ran out of fuel, and they took place at night.
One trip in particular caught the eye of the courts. It took place on December 14, 1977, the day 12 people were dropped to their deaths in the sea. The documents found in the plane proved the guilt of 2 pilots, leading them to be sentenced to life in prison, and bringing new meaning to Miriam's life.
I never understood why I survived when so many others died. But after those pilots were identified and found guilty, it helped me understand why I had survived.
Among those who were killed on the flight in December 1977 were 2 French nuns, along with 3 mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, searching for their children who had been kidnapped by the regime. Their memory is still celebrated every year in Argentina.
You never stopped protesting, even though you were persecuted, tortured, even though 3 of you were executed.
Mabel Carriaga's mother was one of the victims thrown from the Skyvan that night in December. Mabel became one of the activists demanding the plane be repatriated.
In November 2017, the pilots of the death flights were sentenced. And after that, we started thinking that this plane needed to be here in Argentina. We had to overcome a lot of bureaucratic challenges. The plane wasn't for sale. We ended up at the Economy Ministry, which decided to buy the plane and repatriate it.
Cecilia de Vincenti, whose mother was also killed in the Skyvan, joined Mabel in the years-long fight to get the plane back.
For us, it's very important that the story has a concrete ending. The fact that the plane's been repatriated to Argentina means we can show those people who remain in denial, who say that some things didn't really take place, that look, this plane is another piece of evidence.
The last Argentinian Skyvan will soon find a permanent home in Buenos Aires' Museum of Memory. There, this symbol of the dictatorship's death flights will be exhibited as undeniable evidence of one of Argentina's darkest eras.